Hi everybody, welcome. You're in for a treat. We have with us four wonderful writers, novelists, thinkers as well. And though their first books have been published at different times in the recent years, we are going to talk and explore what it means and what it's like to embark on a career as a novelist, the experience of seeing your work, your book in the world, and where their books came from. So I'm just going to begin actually by talking to them individually first about their books, and then we'll broaden the conversation and certainly have time for your questions and thoughts. I wanted to, and I'll introduce them as well a little bit. We'll begin with Tanwi Nandini Islam is author of the really critically acclaimed book, Bright Lines. She also runs a beauty and fragrance company called High Wildflower. So it struck me that High Wildflower, your beauty company, was founded in 2014. Your book came out in 2015. Is there any relationship between concocting fragrances and writing books, or is that just too pungent a metaphor?
So in 2013, I was laid off from a job, and I had to come to my own devices to focus on writing fiction full-time and making money. So I started making candles on my stovetop and selling them to local shops. And it kind of grew into this company. We're in a few hundred stores now. But that process of bootstrapping, I think, is very much a part of writing a novel, where you have to get all your wits about you to go forward with a project. And it was very overwhelming to start a new company, but at the same time, I became free to focus on my writing because my income stream is not dependent on anyone else, it's only dependent on me. So I put more of this onus on myself to create. Fragrances are very much encapsulations of stories, so I take materials from all over the world to make them, and in doing that, I think that is a parallel metaphor to the act of creating a novel, you know, like the stories that are in each fragrance, whether I'm summoning the redwood forest or the market in New Delhi, you know, that process takes me into a kind of olfactory trip that I do see as a sister project to writing a novel. So they're very much informed. My new book that I'm working on now is extremely informed by olfaction. So I think the more that I start writing novels, it's like using this other sense to guide me. It's pretty fun.
Your book is very much rooted in place, specifically Cambridge Place, which happens to be a street around the corner from where I live. I wonder, how did you get there? How did you get to that destination, and why that place?
So when I moved to Brooklyn in 2004, I was completely taken by the historical brownstone streets of the neighborhood, and a lot of the people who are doing construction and renovating the brownstones are Bangladeshi immigrants. So it's almost like the behind-the-scenes people that are creating the facade of a brownstone are these brown people who are my people. So I wanted to kind of locate them inside of one of these structures. And Cambridge Place, to me, I mean, it's a really quiet block. I mean, it's very calm and quiet. But I wanted to create this sort of Edenic kind of sanctuary space for this family to be, you know, recreating their homeland that they left behind, Bangladesh, in Brooklyn. So kind of this, you know, space that's liminal between the two, that they're always existing within.
You know, your family is from Bangladesh. You grew up not in New York City, but around the country, and then eventually upstate New York. Mm-hmm. Were you, as you wrote this book, were you thinking about, I mean, you must have been thinking a little bit about your own family. Is the book a way for you to represent their experience or to think about their experience, or is it a departure completely?
I think for the first book, you feel this intense pressure to take all the experiences of your life that have shaped you and to somehow synthesize them into the novel. And I definitely felt pressure or calling, I would say a calling to do that. I felt, you know, that my parents came after the war with Pakistan, after the Liberation War in the 70s. And I wanted to somehow incorporate that history, but also to talk about what it means to be a young person growing up in Brooklyn. I worked with young people. I was a community organizer and an educator for 10 years, and I wanted to thread those experiences together while honoring our legacy of the past, which is invisibilized in the canon of Indian American literature. I mean, not many people know about Bangladesh and our history. So I definitely wanted to talk about what it was like to live through the war, and also what it means to leave behind a home because you're starting a new life after a war, and how the long shadow of war affects not only the parents in the novel, but also their children, because that's not something we talked about much until we got older, until it was considered appropriate to let us know about the deep violence that they witnessed as young people, you know? So it's talking about the violence of the past and how they kind of forged ahead into moving to a new country, which is a very common theme, I think, for many of us who are writing between homelands. But I think in terms of Bangladesh, it is in this kind of interesting syncretic hub of Islam and Hinduism and Bengali culture, all the things that I kind of write about, that allows us to go back into history, but also think about the future for the characters in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, living in New York City, it's actually quite interesting to see that it's very clear that Bangladeshis are growing, they're one of the fastest growing
750,000
immigrant communities in New York, and increasingly, if you're on the subway, you'll see official signs written in Bengali. Does that, I mean, do you feel very connected to that community? I mean, you live in a different part of the city, but is that for you a source of connection, of place?
I think it's just an orientation that I'm not other, I'm a part of, and I'm always looking for that. I think as people of color, as you know, people who have homelands that are not in the West, we're always othering, you know, we're always othered or othering, and I feel like very much connected to my people, whether I'm going into a car, whether I'm going to a party, I see my people everywhere. I'm inundated with Bengali people, and I love that. I feel connected to my homeland in an instant, and that instant passes, and I feel grateful for that. So.
Great. I'm going to turn to Omar. Omar Robert Hamilton is the author of The City Always Wins. He's also, which is a novel about the revolution in Egypt. He's also an award-winning filmmaker and a journalist. You're also a journalist, in addition to writing fiction. What was your experience of those years that made you feel that journalism was inadequate to its representation, that you had to tackle it with fiction?
Well, it was a double issue because I was also working in film, so I was part of I had set up like a media collective with a group of friends, and we had been making videos that had been sort of reporting from the street of the Egyptian revolution and kind of putting things out very quickly, very live, and we were kind of considered ourselves a very kind of partisan media wing of the revolution. And so when the military coup of 2013 happened, on the one hand, the work of journalism became very, very, very difficult and you know, actively life-threatening, and they killed journalists and they killed people with cameras. And on the other hand, something about I think the failure of the form to actually deliver the political project that we were working towards, as when kind of faced with the level of violence that the Egyptian state was able to mobilize, and the way that it was supported by every international regime everywhere, and the way that it was supported also by a very large section of the populace domestically. Those three things together kind of really made me lose faith, or my relationship with the image, and with the image as a news image. So I kind of spent about a year really not knowing what to do, and not being able to work in any meaningful way. And then I found myself writing, and found that what was being produced was not really historical, and it wasn't really poetry, but it wasn't what it was going to be, or what it turned into quite quickly was a novel. And I kind of found the words really kind of pouring out myself, and it kind of unblocked some failure to process, or some failure to deal with what had been happening. And so for me, I had then this sort of pretty extensive reservoir of information and emotion about the years that had come before, and I just kind of focused on getting that down on paper in a form that I felt, in the end the novel was the form that kind of allowed, it's also a form that kind of allows you to do anything within it, right? A novel can have deeply personal, poetic prose, and it can also have very kind of like factual, historical, overviewing prose. It can have tweets, it can have news headlines. You can kind of take everything and throw it in. So it's as a form, it kind of allowed me to do everything I needed.
So it is a capacious kind of form. You still have at the heart of it a romance, which is a somewhat more conventional anchor or sort of spine to a novel. And it's a frustrated romance that sort of bears in part the symbolic weight of the frustration of the revolution, right? Did you in writing the book, did you come to the inclusion of the romance or building around this relationship first, or was it something that you felt was necessary for the writing of a novel?
Yeah, no, I think I needed it for the architecture, really. If I could have found a way of writing a novel without characters, I kind of would have maybe. And I think at first, the things that we would think of as traditional characterization were quite low down on my they were not really what was being produced. What was being produced was much more kind of like meta, poetic, and also kind of factual and historical prose. And in the end, what I needed to turn something into a kind of coherent experience, I guess, for a reader that isn't just kind of following my thoughts, was then to actually develop the characters and to allow them to actually divide them from myself, I suppose, in the end, was the kind of the key struggle. And one of the things that I found very difficult, actually, was to create two characters that were not just actually extensions of me, but were kind of somehow acting within their own kind of characteristics within the novel. And once I had them, then it became much easier to then kind of have an entire architecture that, hopefully for a reader, gives you some of the more traditional expectations of what you're kind of looking for in story or fiction.
There's this cliche that fact is stranger than fiction, but it's so often can be quite true in the sense you include a detail in the novel about how at one point the Egyptian military propagates the idea that it's found a cure for AIDS, which is something they actually did disseminate, that notion. As somebody who's attentive to the often absurdity of the world outside us, did you feel that fiction, the way you can adorn with fiction, was something that could complement that, or when the world is so strange as it is, how does fiction find a way to include that strangeness?
Well, I think what's good about fiction is it doesn't have to present you the answers necessarily. So fiction, you can allow yourself space to be satirical, to be enraged, to be kind of dismissive, So again, it's the wonderful thing about the form of the novel. It has so much space within it for you to kind of hold different hats, that's not a metaphor, to sort of have your different pens. And in the end, I think also one of the things that it does is that you're writing at a timescale that's totally different, right? You're writing not for the now, you're not writing for the internet, you're not writing for Twitter, you're not writing to change the world tomorrow. You're writing because this book is then going to sit on a shelf, and its responsibility is somehow abrogated, which also takes the pressure off you as a writer, right? Like, you don't have to change the world tomorrow with this book. It can go and exist and disseminate in ways that you can't foretell in any shape or form, because actually the life of a novelistic text or a book's text is so different and so much longer than all of the other kind of texts and media that we work in. And so again, I think that's kind of what made it an attractive form.
Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi is an author from Uganda. She's won several prizes for her fiction, including the Windham-Campbell Lit Prize. And her first novel is Kintu, and she has, I believe, another book coming out in 2020, maybe a short story collection before then. In the forward to the American edition of Kintu, it was hailed as the great Ugandan novel. And you've said yourself that this is a book you wanted to write for Ugandans. amusingly, at a session you were speaking at yesterday, you also at the same time were commenting on the artificiality of the borders of Uganda, of how it's an identity and a nation that was imposed on a territory where such a concept is not necessarily a natural to it. I wonder if there's any tension there. I mean, is as a project for Ugandans, by a writer who also sees the nation as something of an invented idea, do you see any tension there?
No. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to talk to First Novelist. Nobody knows First Novelist, you know. We're just building an audience, but thanks for being patient and coming along. I wrote my novel specifically for Ugandan readers, and I did this intentionally. I knew the Anglophone world, the world that reads in English, is wide, and I knew that I would sell perhaps 200, 300 copies in Uganda. But my God, I wrote to Ugandans. Now, this is what happens. Literature came to Africa from the West, okay? And publishers during that time were all in the West. So when the Achebes, the Ngujis, when they wrote their novels, the novels had to travel to Britain to be edited, to be marketed. So you wrote in a way like you're writing to the West, okay? At the same time, they wrote during colonization, and they were writing to the West, this anti-colonial writing, which is saying, look what you're doing to us. You need to stop this. But for a long time, because all the publishing is being done in the West, we've been writing like that. Like our readers are in the West. So we are always explaining ourselves. We used glossaries. We did all sorts of things. But do you see, African readers are also intelligent. You write in a particular way, and they know you're not writing for us. Okay? So why are you explaining this word? I know it. Okay? And when the West writes, they do not write to Africans. For goodness sakes, I grew up on the equator. I had never seen snow. I don't know what winter is like, but I was doing Shakespeare. And, in the winter of our discontent. If I could understand that, and we are not considered the most intelligent people, for goodness sakes, the British will understand my literature. So I'm going to write to Ugandans. And so when I started writing like that, my attitude changed. The way I write when I'm writing to the whole world, I'm careful, I am very polite, I say certain things. But when I'm writing to Ugandans, like I pull out the stuff, like, whoa, So my books changed, the way it was written, it changed. And actually, when the book was sent to British publishers, they rejected it. They said it was too African. I said, thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for.
So Kintu is sort of a multi-generational saga of a kind, but you very deliberately don't spend much time or dwell on the colonial period or indeed Idi Amin's dictatorship. Why did you do that?
Well, luckily, when I started writing, I had been teaching literature in Africa for a very long time. And then after that, I went and studied in Britain. And I had noticed how African books are taught. So maybe you're familiar with Things Fall Apart, okay? Now, when I was studying Things Fall Apart in Uganda, we considered Okonkwo the father, Okonkwo the husband, Okonkwo the man, and how fear elevated him to the heavens, but at the same time, fear brought him down. When I arrived in Britain, they were talking about colonization. For goodness sake, in that book, you don't meet colonizers until way further in the book. But oh my God, look what we did to Africans. And then I realized that this is the way people read. When you write colonization, the West are going to look at themselves and how they performed in Africa. But I want people to read about Ugandans. I want people to see how ugly we are, but how beautiful we are, how stupid and how intelligent, how wonderful we are. I'm not writing a book about you, you know. So I said, okay, thank you very much. I'm going to cut colonization out to force the world to look at Ugandans. But at the same time, when you look at Idi Amin was a large person in real life. But put Idi Amin in your book, and people will forget everything. And, Idi Amin, he was a monster. Oh, what a terrible man. I thought, you know what? I'm tired of Idi Amin. I cut both of those things out and force people to look at Uganda.
I heard somebody to describe your book as a kind of archaeological project, that in imagining a kind of mythic history, delving, borrowing from folklore, oral culture, that you were reconstructing or excavating maybe a kind of history for Uganda that maybe Ugandans had been removed from. Is that a fair description? What do you think of that? What would you think of yourself as an archaeologist?
Well, this is again a reaction to the way African literature is read. If you read Hegel, he says that Africa did not have a history before Europe arrived. And so I started my novel in the 1700s, and I look at Buganda Kingdom and what it was like before Europe arrived. And then I skipped Europe arriving. And then I went in 2004. And I focused mainly on the culture and on the landscape. And it was really historical. I had to do my research very well. But I wanted people to see this is what we were before colonization, without talking about colonization. This is what is happening to us now. I wanted us to do that comparison, but also to look back in history and say, okay, where did this come from? We are called Uganda, but we are called Uganda because we say it was Buganda, but our B is silent. So the British didn't hear the B. And so, they just decided, okay, this part and that part and that part, you're all Buganda. And our people who were not Baganda were like, oh my God, suddenly we are part of this terrible nation, But I wanted us to do it on our terms. Because that history was written by Europe. And I wanted a history that is mined by me, a Ugandan. And I was always telling people, this is my idea of our history.
Great. I'm going to turn to Anuk Arudpragasam, who is the author of The Story of a Brief Marriage, which won the DSC Prize here in India, and as well as the Shakti Bhatt Prize, along with many other acclaims. It's a novel set in the sort of, I suppose, the most recent chapter of the war in Sri Lanka. Anuk, there are so many books that have come out of the troubles in Sri Lanka. What did you feel that, were you thinking about this corpus of other novels when you turned to it? And did you, or were there things you wanted to depart from? Were you conscious of your book's relation to that other literature?
Not really, no. I haven't read any of the other books about the war in English. I have read, there's a lot of Tamil literature, poetry, novels about the war, and I've read some of those, and I'm highly conscious of my relationship to Tamil writers writing about the war as an English writer myself. But I haven't read much of the Sri Lankan English language writing.
Well, then, could you talk a little bit about the Tamil literature that you read about it? Was that a source of inspiration or help in writing the book, or no?
No, I mean, inspiration is a funny word to use when you're writing about a genocide, but I would read those writers, and a lot of them were people who are either diasporic now, living in Paris or Toronto, or people within Sri Lanka itself. And they've all lived through the war in a way that I haven't, because I grew up in Colombo in very privileged circumstances. So if anything, I would obviously have to write this novel differently about the war, because I'm writing about something that is very far from my own experience, and I'm writing it out of guilt, as opposed to most of these people who are writing out of something that they have experienced very viscerally, and who are not writing out of guilt, but writing out of some kind of trauma. So I would read those poems and stuff. Listen to interviews that they gave. Funnily, I never met any of these writers until after I published my novel, and then I'm always embarrassed, about what they will say or but they've all been very nice to me.
The main character, Dinesh, is very pensive, almost meditative. You're finishing a PhD in philosophy. Any connection?
Any connection? Yeah, I was interested in philosophy at a certain point, and I'm still interested in philosophy, and that's because I was interested, in when you're 15 or 16 and you have questions about how should I live, what is this life about, why do I have these feelings, why do I hate this why do I hate this group of people, why do I desire this group of people? You have all sorts of questions. And you don't really even know how to formulate those questions. Philosophy, at a certain point, seemed to me like a place where I can begin to ask those questions or begin to approach those questions. And this main character, who is stuck in the midst of this very violent situation, is also a person who is asking philosophical questions, because I think philosophy, actually not as it's practiced in the university. Philosophy as it's practiced in the university is generally a very mechanical, a very dull, a very logic-oriented, kind of mundane activity. But philosophy, as often as people come into contact with philosophy, it comes in a moment of wonder. And there are only certain moments in life when you feel moved to stop and reflect at things as a whole with a kind of wonder. And so the main character of my novel is in a situation in which everybody around him is being killed, and he is suddenly being asked to marry a woman out of consideration for the woman's safety during this very violent time. And a question is being put to him that kind of shocks him, and that forces him to step away from the situation and look at it as a whole, and to suddenly ask himself questions like, why do people talk? What do people want when they touch each other? How should I organize my day? What is the difference between evening and afternoon, and the lights and the light of evening and the light of afternoon, and what should I do in those times? These are questions. He's moved to ask philosophical questions because he's also caught up in a moment of wonder, but it's a moment of wonder that is instigated by horror.
Speaking of that horror, when the Tamil army, the Sri Lankan army closed in on the peninsula, and the alleged genocide happened. Genocide happened. Where were you, and how did you experience that moment? For a lot of us on the outside, it happened sort of behind a screen, behind a veil. There weren't reporters. There weren't CNN cameras there showing us the bombs coming in, and we had to rely on sort of fragmentary accounts that we got. How did you experience it, learn about it, follow it?
That's right. The Sri Lankan government asked all foreign observers and all journalists to clear out of the area. And so the UN and everybody left. So most Tamil people would follow from a series of Tamil websites, diasporic websites. People would post on their Facebooks. Occasionally, people who were in the area would upload images and videos that made their way to YouTube, and you can usually find all of these materials in various hidden locations on the internet. And so it just trickles. You hear it being whispered in many places. Tamil radio stations. Like a lot of people in Colombo, like me, would hear it from diasporic sources. People in the diaspora who had actual relatives there in the Northeast, or from diasporic news organizations. But these news organizations were obviously not news organizations that the BBC would ever cite.
I suppose I also was asking, what was it like for you to see this happen, to sense that this was happening and be powerless and to be far away from it?
I felt, what is there to say?
I'm going to just open up slightly more to the rest of the panel and ask something slightly more general, which is, after your first novel was published, what was the most surprising thing that happened, either in terms of reaction or where the book took you?
I feel like everyone's looking at me to answer. Did you ask me the question directly? Sorry, I just had a moment. I was looking at all of you. So when I published my book, I was not writing for a literary audience at all. I was writing to get this story out. So I think the big thing when I debuted my book was just seeing all the people in my life that I've interacted with, whether it was from my community organizing work or teaching young people or, my Bangladeshi community, my family, all these different kind of communities rallying around this work. Like, that's a thrilling moment for a writer, to see people see so deeply into you, and I think that to see how one's mind works, how you create a universe, how you create this very contained story, but it, has everything that you've wanted to say inside of it. You're talking to Uganda. I wanted to talk about a spectrum of gender and sexuality of the Muslim diaspora, whether it's Bangladesh or the people in this community in Brooklyn. To share that with people was thrilling for me. But I think that the pleasant surprise of that was having literary community and writers come out of that and meeting other writers to dialogue about why we're doing the work that we're doing. So I think that, that was kind of a thrill to have that moment. I also think you have to reckon with criticism of your work. And I found that I'm pretty thick-skinned about criticism, because I'm not writing for anyone on the planet. I'm writing for myself and for my, my people, not even meaning Bangladeshi people, but people who can specifically connect to these characters. So I think finding that I was sort of impervious to people's critique of, not thinking the book was accurate in some way or didn't serve the purposes that they thought it should serve, I stopped really worrying about that. And I think I felt empowered to kind of talk about the book as something that I created to address all the things that I, think about and write about and want to put into this work.
Do you read your reviews?
Yeah, totally.
Oh my God,
yeah.
You're gonna go mad.
No, I love it. I just think that I get sometimes, I don't know if all of you read your reviews. If it's in a paper, like a news magazine, whatever website, yes, I'll read it. But I'll even read the 1-star Goodreads review that's goes in, and it's kind of an attack, because I think we have to defend our work in some way, but we also are creating it in this sort of vacuum almost when we're writing. When I'm writing, I am sequestered away in my nightie, hunched over the computer, I'm in my glasses. I'm very myopic when I'm writing. So then you're forcing us to talk about this, and it's I don't know if it's traumatic, but it's definitely okay, well, now it's not mine anymore. It's it belongs to the world. And I perversely want to know what the world thinks, and then I want to be well, I don't give a shit what you think. You know what I mean? whatever. It's kind of like a nice way to defend your work. So I don't go crazy. I take a sick thrill in reading.
For me, it's like cutting the umbilical cord. I would like my book to go out and defend itself. If it can't defend itself, then it sinks. Because I can't follow it everywhere it goes. And sometimes people say the most hurtful things. You sat down, I wrote my book in 10 years, and I worked very hard. And then someone with a stroke of a pen destroys everything you've created. But if you destroy the book, at least don't destroy me along. Allow me to write another book. So I see a review, or my publisher says, okay, there's been this review. I look at it and I put it away in case I'll need to talk about it in future when I'm talking about my book. But I know if I read a review and someone has said, especially when they've said something true, and I look at it and say, I should have, that kills me. So, no.
Omar, your book, I think, has come out most recently of all the first novels on this stage. I'm curious about any kinds of interesting experiences you had in the wake of its publication, but also since you were part of a collective, you had colleagues who went through the same things you did. How did they react to the book?
Well, I think there are two different kinds of reactions that have happened. There is one reaction from close friends who know that they cannot read the book now, and they've put it on a shelf, and they will look at it in 10 years. And there's a lot of people dealing with different levels of sort of trauma and PTSDs and depressions and a very long-running aftermath of kind of counter-revolutionary defeat. For me, the nice and the surprising reactions have come from younger people in particular. And it's kind of a mark in that suddenly I'm kind of not a young person. Like also I think writing the book has kind of transitioned me from being a young person to being an adult somehow. I'm now 34. Yeah. It feels old to me. But I get people now coming up to me, they're like 20, 21. They were too young to actually be out in the street of the revolution, but they were watching on TV and it's sort of given them some way of connecting with what they feel is their history and what very much in Egypt feels like contemporary history, and like it's like the chapter of history that we are in Egypt began in 2011. And so the fact that it's found some kind of audience among people who it's then allowed to find the connection with their own history in that way has actually been very, very pleasantly surprising.
Has it been translated into Arabic?
It's nearly done, yeah. It's nearly done.
Anuk, anything happened that was particularly striking? I mean, obviously the book won many awards, but I'm curious, did it make a splash in Sri Lanka or amongst communities in diaspora? And have you received any interesting reactions from that?
It's had a lot of effect. I think publishing a book would have would cause, a lot of good things and a lot of bad things to happen. In Sri Lanka, there are 50,000 first language English speakers in Sri Lanka, and I'm not sure how many of those people actually read. So, but they have an outsized voice in how the country is perceived, or like in representing the country to people outside. So it didn't make a splash at all in Sri Lanka, because in Sri Lanka, most people have other problems than to read. With me, I think, there's a certain kind of security or a certain kind of comfort. You no longer feel that, if you're writing for many, for years on your own without receiving any kind of recognition from the outside, it's nice to be occasionally told from somebody outside, when is this thing that you're writing coming? Oh, how are you doing on this thing that you're writing? It's nice to feel that it's not just an effort of will on my part to push it through, and that there are people on the other side also asking about it, bringing it, helping me bring it forward in a way just by asking maybe sometimes. So that's been really nice. One of the negative, we were talking, you guys were talking about dealing with criticism. I find it actually almost difficult, more difficult I would say, to deal with praise when people are, it's very difficult to know, sometimes people will just look at you and say something very nice, and it is very nice. but it's a funny thing when, there's not much you can say in response to it, and it doesn't really necessarily help you in the way that a critique would help you or a criticism would help you. Yeah, and it's also a strange feeling you don't control who you read, who you're read by, and so what you write is accessible to many, many people. And when you wrote, or when I write, I feel that I'm writing to myself or some future self or some past self, and sometimes I feel like I'm writing to my sister, but it doesn't feel like I'm writing to such like a large and faceless, because I don't know who's reading, audience, and then people will say something that they'll say that they've read your novel, and I almost don't believe that they have, even if they have, even if they say they have, and even if I just don't quite believe it.
In the responses to your books, have any of you learned something about the book that you didn't already know? That happened to me actually when I published my book. I feel like some good readers can help teach you about your own book. Do any of you have that experience?
I definitely have this. See, when you write a book, you have to read it over and over and over again at readings. And in that process, I found either I am like, damn it, why did I write it this way? I would have written it totally differently. And I actually am like rewriting it as I'm looking at the text, and it drives me insane. I hate that feeling. But then another feeling is that, I also had a 10-year journey. I think the first novel often takes a 10-year journey for people, from like inception to publication. And I have this feeling of like this layer of my brain was able to do this, and it's gonna let me go deeper in the next book and the next book, and I'm starting to build a relationship between books because I'm working on my second and third book now. So I really think that your first book is the way you kind of launch yourself, and I'm proud of how I was able to take all this information in my life and put it into this book. That was the only way that I could have done it. And I think it's like almost like accepting yourself without driving yourself crazy, is that this is the book that I could have write. I started when I was 24, but that was what I could do. And it's almost like this muscle memory that you're building as a writer, and that's where I was able to go with it at that time. And I think you accept it, and even though it drives you crazy, or I'm tired of talking about the first book, sorry. That's one of the things that you get tired of. You're like, I'm ready to write more books. So I think that is the relation. Your first book sort of sets the stage for you in a way for your work. And I love diving into it and seeing what I did and how I would do it differently now.
When I was writing, I had a specific subject, and I had specific things I was doing. But what I was doing and what the text was doing were two different things. And it took me a long time to work this out so that I could suppress things that I don't want to talk about, or so that I could highlight things that I wanted to talk about. And because I was writing this novel for a long time, I thought I knew everything until the book was published. And some clever people who've read it would stand there and say, Jennifer, in this book you're dealing with this and this and that. So can you talk about this? And I have no idea where that came from. And between the question and me picking up the microphone and answering him, I have to quite quickly and say, oh yes, I was, that I found incredibly difficult. And it happened to me when I went to Oxford University. It was bound to happen at Oxford University. And this very old man said, oh, I've heard you say you did not write about colonization and how colonization would swallow up your writing. But actually, the more you avoided it, the more colonization was screaming in your novel. I said, well, what can you do? I try to avoid it, but it's been written back by readers.
I mean, there have been quite a few academic pieces written, and in many of them, yeah, they've pulled out threads that I didn't really know were there, or like that I knew that I was working around themes, like I'd have themes to do with music, or themes to do with the natural world, or themes to do with memory. And then, yeah, in essays, like those kind of, what looks then ultimately much more structured and much more artistic than perhaps I was actually architecting, have been pulled out, which of course sort of makes you feel like you kind of, that something sort of in some subconscious level of production was working nicely. And there were kind of some things like, you know, I kind of put in some like hidden things that only I would ever know. Like there's a whole theme of like the metamorphoses running through it that no reader will ever be able to find. And they haven't. But somebody wrote to me, an academic, and he had a very kind of long analysis about how the book follows the Orpheus myth. And it was very convincing. And so, yeah, readers do pull out smart analyses, and I guess like the lesson being that because it was written with some kind of thematic consistencies and some, I guess, yeah, that those are then able to be pulled out, and so it's been nice to get those.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally you meet readers who say things that surprise you and that teach you about yourself, and you're very grateful. Yeah, and that's happened a few times. But of course, there's also, and that's what I actually hoped for from reviews. But my sense is that people who write reviews are not actually interested in really. I mean, they would say nice things or negative things or indifferent things, but they don't really. I mean, you know, I mean, they're probably very sleepy when they read and when they write, and they probably have 8 or 9 assignments to do, and they're not actually, I mean, really engaging with a book. And so they write something, but I have been disappointed by my sense that these people have nothing to say to me that I can learn from. But there are such people, and it's very satisfying when you meet such people and when they speak
I think
to you.
critics should be trembling at the prospect of your criticism. You're going to indulge me one cheesy question, quick one, and then we're going to go to the audience for their questions. And that is, if you could take your first book and plop it in the lap of any writer, living or dead, who would that be? If you could take your first book and give it to any writer to read, living or dead, who would that be?
A writer to read my book.
Okay, well, while they're thinking, why don't we turn to the audience? There's a woman in red in the front.
Hello. Is this working? Yeah. So it's always interesting to hear about the journey to publication for a first novel because they're all unique, and I'm wondering if you could share your story.
I did my novel, I offered it for the PhD. And just as I finished, there was a call out from Kenya, a Kwani Manuscript Project. And so, because in Africa, even to get published is like to win an award. So this guy said, okay, let's take manuscripts. So I was lucky and I sent in my manuscript and it won and then it got published. But then after winning the manuscript project, I thought, okay, the West is going to line up for my book. And I remember my agent sending out the book to all big publishers in Britain. And rejection after rejection after rejection. I mean, at one point I became numb. And the rejection letters, oh, Jennifer is a talented author, but get to us with her second novel. Oh, she has no idea how to handle form. She needs to do this or do that. And so it took 4 years before my book came out in the US. But here's what happened. In the US, when it was released, there's something called Publishers Weekly. They reviewed it and gave it a star. And I swear to you, all the publishers that rejected it in Britain sent back and said, can we have Jennifer's book? Can you say? And I was like, you rejected. Do they even read the books they reject? Even my publisher rejected it. So we were having dinner after the launch, and he said, I cannot believe we've got you. And I said, but you rejected it. And she said, no. I said, I'll send you the email. I keep all my rejection letters.
So for me, I did an MFA program. Did any of you do an MFA program? MA. So you're way cooler than me. I did an MFA program. I went to a Brooklyn College MFA. And I found my agent through a friend who worked with her at an agency. And then, you know, it wasn't an exact vibe or connection, but I had that desperation of, well, you want to take me, I'll go with you, let's do this. So I just went with it. And she did sell my book. But then after my book came out, you know, that process was actually not as, it was like, I only found one editor who wanted it, and all you need is one. You know what I mean? No one else wanted it. So it was rejection, 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 but that one editor wanted it, and she's my editor now. But then my relationship with my agent changed, so I had to let go of that relationship because she was always telling me, you're too angry, or you need to tone it down. Anger is all the vogue now. Anger is the trend now. But 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it was like, you know, you need to think of your career. You need to think of who you know, what it's like to publish books, you know, if you're talking so openly about things you're angry about. So we parted ways, and I had to find a new one. And I was alone for the last few years, and I just started again with someone new in September. So I think that there's this thing as like, it's not it's not static. It's always constantly evolving and shifting. Your needs change. Your first book to your second book, your needs change. The market changes. So I think these are things that like I've learned. But when you're kind of thrown into the ring for your first book, you don't know any of this stuff. You're just like, I hope it. You know, you put a prayer on it and you go. You just hope it's gonna work out. So I'm actually. It wasn't like, you know, that traumatizing. Once you find the one person, that's all you need. Yeah. And Clarice Lispector, for sure, for your question.
Okay, good. Yeah. Thanks. Do you want to add anything, or I can take more questions?
We can more questions.
Any questions in the back? Okay, that's as far back. So maybe the woman on the right-hand side in black?
Hello, I'm Ria, and I have some questions because I want to write books.
Question, sorry.
Yeah. So the first book that you all wrote, did it excite you or did it scare you? Did rejection ever like stop you, or how did you go about it?
You have 6 minutes.
I think I spent a lot of time, when I wrote, I didn't really have connections to writers and the publishing industry, and fortunately I still keep those connections at a minimum. But when I was writing, I had none at all, and I like focused all of my energy on my writing. And I was obviously very keen, because to a writer it means a lot to be recognized by somebody outside of yourself. But I think, I remember before I sent my manuscript out, feeling or telling my friend, well, if this book doesn't get published, then I'm not gonna write again, or forget about it. And then my friend was like, well, then you're not a writer, because the writing itself is not meaning enough to you that you would continue it regardless of, and of course there are all sorts of things that come into play: how you earn your money, how much free time you have, what kind of obligations you have to friends and family, and it's foolish to think of in black and white terms, like, does this mean enough that I will sacrifice everything for this? I mean, that's not how it works usually, but I think I realized at that point when he asked me this question that what it gives me in my day-to-day life, that it's a kind of practice, and that I value and respect its presence in my life enough that I will continue to give it that place when I can. And I think, so this was something I kept in mind, that I will continue doing this regardless of whether this person says yes or no. And the other thing is that I think, I'm not trying to be smart, but the fact is that most most published writers are not necessarily that great. I mean, publication doesn't mean that much actually. That probably the profounder poets and writers were too busy writing to care too much about getting published or updating their social media. And so these people, I like to imagine that there are writers that I really love. I just have not read them, and I probably would not get a chance to read them, but the thought consoles me that these texts exist in some form somewhere. And I think when you have that in mind, that you're part of some invisible community of people who are committed to literature and respect it and respect what it can give you as a writer, then I think that would give you strength. And it would give you strength to also go through the nonsense that's involved with dealing with people in the industry, and also maybe like some kind of strength to continue what you're doing and to be committed to it regardless of what they say.
Hello, everyone. My question is, as first novelists, you want to put your best work forward, and you constantly keep revising what you've written. So at what point do you let go and decide, okay, this is perfect, and I can send it out for people to see?
I don't know. I mean, I guess at some point, if you go away from a text for a month and then you come back and you look at it and for me, when a piece when it looks like I kind of can't even remember how I did that, or like that I wouldn't be able to do it again now if I sat down to do it, and I don't know, you let yourself cool off from it, and then once you go back and have a critical eye on it, and if it seems beyond you at that point, then maybe then it's done.
Any of you can answer this. I just wanted to know, has the success of your first book put any needless pressure on you regarding the second one?
Who feels pressure?
Yes. I felt very, I don't even know if it was the success. I think it was what I did, and then wanting to do something completely different. It's like wanting to become a different person, and then the world already thinks they know you, and then you don't know if you're allowed to do that. So I completely fell apart after my book came out. I don't know if, now we're getting into like the deep stuff, I guess, of falling apart, but I had a deep depression because I had to go into a new work, and I wanted to do something completely different. So for my first book, there's a structure. It's, a family story, a love story, a coming-of-age story. But for now, what I'm working on, I wanted to go into a speculative fiction, sci-fi, embodiment story. And that is a scary shift to make. I felt like I kind of slipped off a cliff onto a new terrain, and I have to create this persona. I'm writing under a pen name right now, like a lot. Yeah, I don't want that name anymore. I'm done with that. So I'm having a big moment with redoing a lot of things. So I think that what we can all kind of do is shut out that noise so that we can go into the next work with our full heart and like our mind, and just do what we're meant to do with that work. Each book has its own rules and its own, kind of needs, So for me, I had to kind of get out of my mind, oh, you write about Bangladeshi immigrants in New York. And I don't want to be stuck writing that all the time. Yes, I wanted to write that for my first book, but I think the pressure of that, it took 2 years to kind of undo that to start writing new work. And now I feel really lucky that, I think this new work will pivot me into another kind of conversation. And I think that's all we can hope for, is that we can keep evolving our work and not be pigeonholed into what people think we should do. And as, you know, third world writers, writers of color, people, I mean, I'm writing in an American market. I feel like I have to not get pigeonholed because it's so easy for that to happen to me, to represent a voice of a community. I don't want that responsibility. I want to keep growing as a writer. So yeah, I did feel that pressure, but I'm on the other side of it now and I don't care anymore.
Well, I think we can all look forward to all four of you growing as writers and building on the great success you've already had. The clock is reading triple zeros at me, quadruple zeros at me, so I'm afraid we're out of time, but I believe the authors will all be signing books afterwards.
They will be signing books.
They'll be signing books afterwards, so you can come there with your books for them to sign, and you can ask them questions there as well. Thank you so much for being such a fine audience. Thank you.